You want to get the Armenian thing out of the way so you can do the mainstream stuff.
Well, that's the way it works in my head. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And I think it kind of works that way with a lot of other people, too.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Language Therapy with Dr. K. My guest today is Christopher Atamian. Poet, novelist, playwright, translator, curator, critic, filmmaker, documentarian, and gallery founder. Yes, it's a mouthful because he has lived and continues to live multiple lives. As a polyglot, someone who speaks and has learned over a dozen languages, Chris authored a piece on Armenian language anxiety, Armenian being the language that he has struggled most with. So we delve into language anxiety and its different manifestations, foreign language anxiety versus heritage language anxiety, his own trajectory with his heritage language and how perhaps that's connected to paternity and his relationship with his father, but also fatherland, homeland, the burden of carrying a 4,000-year-old heritage. We talk about his role as a translator, texts he's currently working on and has translated, and his process and method for translating, sometimes depending on intermediary translations and languages. We talk about contemporary Armenian literature and his desire to introduce contemporary writers to the larger literary audience and what he appreciates so much about them. And we talk about his work across media, both as a creator but also as a connector. So stay tuned for a very interesting conversation that is simultaneously personal, scholarly, literary, and deep. Christopher Atamian, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So I always start with my traditional question, which is tell me the story of your life through your languages. But I'm scared to ask you because there are too many languages, and I think we may spend the rest of the hour talking about 14 languages that you've picked up on the way.
Well, that might be stretching at 14, but so my first language is French, which I spoke at home because my dad is Armenian from Lebanon, and my mom is Italian from Switzerland and grew up in Geneva, so they spoke French at home and sent me to French school. So I kind of learned French and English concurrently. Then in French school, I took Latin, ancient Greek, and Russian as my foreign language.
Of course.
Right. And then I switched to an American school, and they didn't teach Russian, so I took Spanish. And because I had learned Italian to speak with my grandparents over summer, that was kind of fairly easy between French, Italian, and Spanish. So that was kind of until the end of high school. So I don't know if it's like 5 or 6, 7, something like that. And then and in college, I took German and studied on Fulbright and took Swiss German and Dutch. And I got very bored in Zurich because at the time it was kind of a boring city, although it's not anymore. Like you even had to go like on a Friday if you wanted food to a train station, like past 5 o'clock. Like you could not buy food. So my I took Portuguese because my best friend in New York was Portuguese, and it was similar to French and Spanish. And she was like, "I'll send you to Portugal for a year." And I was like, the best year I've ever had. So that kind of, I guess, was like my 8th or 9th language. And then I realized I didn't speak Armenian, which is kind of scary, right? Given. And I had been sent to Ramgavar, Tashnag, and Mechatur's camp. And my father one day said to me, well, he just started speaking fluent Armenian. I said, I don't know what you're saying. And he's like, well, didn't they teach you Armenian? And I said, and then something very vulgar about someone's mother. And he was like, oh my God, this is terrible. So I learned Armenian with a tutor, Milena Tekmorian, who's at Columbia. And, I think that's about it. And I took a year of Swedish, which I don't speak very well, but I can read.
But of all the languages you've studied, and when I was reading up on you in preparation for this episode, you've even won prizes in French. You translate. Language is so central to what you do. And yet you authored an essay on language anxiety, and it's about Armenian.
It is because, so the interesting thing is when I was a kid, there was like 1 or 2 Armenian restaurants in New York, and there was St. Vartan's Cathedral. They had these Friday night dinners, and my dad would take me And it was mainly Bulsahais and Armenians from Istanbul, and then people from Beirut, more or less. And they would talk to me very quickly in Armenian, and then I would just stare back, and my father would say he doesn't want to speak his own language, or he refuses to learn Armenian. And I would look at him and be like, first of all, my mom is bringing me up mainly. I go to a French school. I live in New York. I don't know any Armenians. Like, where am I? It was such a dumbfounding experience because, like, paternity is very important, right? Like, your dad is like even if you don't get along well with him necessarily, he's like kind of a person you want to look up to. And I think that was kind of drummed into me, that I either didn't want to learn it or I couldn't learn it somehow.
Well, okay, in your essay, you say that Armenian anxiety was, quote, something deeply rooted in the diasporan unconscious and transmitted both subliminally and outwardly. What exactly is being transmitted? Language? Trauma? Obligation? Shame? Memory?
I think a little bit of all five. And I was talking to a friend of mine, Ankine, last night, and she said, we went to a bakery, and the woman was from Iraq. And so we were speaking, and I don't know what word I used. I used Yeri Desart instead of Zavag or something like that. And then I corrected myself, and I said, you see, it's really weird. And she said, well, it's because you don't practice it. But the weird thing is I was in Switzerland a year ago, just with my cousins, and I went to Zurich, and I will speak fluent Swiss German, but I've never really spoken, and I don't make any mistakes, and I might make mistakes, but I don't realize it, and people answer me back like I'm from Zurich, and so it's not just a question of not practicing, it's a question of like a fear thing in your head that kicks in like subliminally.
So I was just telling you that about 10 years ago, I wrote a piece on language anxiety, but particularly heritage language anxiety. Right. And it's interesting how life manifests things. As I was reading your essay, you were like the perfect case study for what I theorized a decade ago. And when I was doing the research for that piece, I did come up with a lot of work on foreign language anxiety, and you cite foreign language anxiety. But one of the arguments I make in my piece is that foreign language anxiety is very different from heritage language anxiety because of the dozen or so languages that you speak. When you speak anything but Armenian, you are performing linguistic competence.
Right.
But when you are attempting to speak Armenian, you are performing identity.
Right, so it's much more at stake, I think.
Exactly. And you are seeking, whether you are aware of it or not, some kind of belonging, or you are experiencing some kind of rejection when you get corrected or you freeze up in your heritage
That's very interesting. I always feel like when a person corrects me or like looks at me strangely, that like I am done something terrible, like the world's about to end. How could you say Zavag instead of Yeri Desad, which are actually the same thing, kind of. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
Like one is youth and one is child.
Yeah. But the thing is, when you make a mistake in German or in Italian or something, no one wags their finger, metaphorically, and says you are not Italian enough or German enough. But what is at stake every time you utter something in Armenian is, are you Armenian enough?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, and the thing is, too, is that I grew up going to French schools, and my mom brought me up who's Italian. So I never really understood I would go to Lebanon in the summers, and first of all, I thought all Armenians were from Lebanon. So, you know, and that was kind of odd when I went to Armenia after.
And confusing, one might argue.
Yeah, it was. And my father never went to the Soviet Union. Well, the other thing is that I think it's different now, but I think for people my age, and I'm in my 50s, Armenia was a place you couldn't visit ever.
Couldn't.
No, you couldn't.
And I think it's hard for folks today to understand that.
In other words, like to me, first of all, the Soviet Union was like the big enemy. Even if you were in French school, and all we did was criticize Americans from morning to night, which also did not exactly integrate me into American society. And we watched, European films, and we read like French books, and like I don't know, everyone else was like watching TV sitcoms, and we were reading like Asterix and Obelix, right?
Yeah.
So it's like a different mentality. But there was this very strong feeling of Armenia was destroyed by the Turks, and then the Soviets invaded, and you'll never be able to go there. And there were tours kind of once, but they were done by like Intourist, and it was unclear to me too why my father wouldn't take those tours. And if you said, why don't we go, he'll go, we'll go one day. Or I don't want to go. Or they speak the wrong language. You know, there was always like this weird excuse. So it became very, on the one hand, very familiar. Like you go to summer camp, and the kids in Ramgavar camp, they're just like funky, average kids from like Long Island. And then and none of them spoke Armenian. And then this very exotic place that you could never go to, kind of. And then there was Lebanon, which was like this, just a beautiful place, but it was very...
like a surrogate homeland?
And no one explained it. It was like you can go see your grandparents. And then if you said what... And they would not tell you... so they would refer to everything as les événements, the events. Like, how did they end up in the events? And you say, what are the events? And they go, I don't want to talk about it, and don't mention it to your grandmother. So you knew that something awful had brought them to Lebanon, but it wasn't like the Holocaust. It was like 5 minutes on TV.
Right.
You know, I don't know if that's good either, that type of trauma inducement for Jewish people, but it was like you weren't even really told at the time exactly what had happened.
So going back to your father, he believed, or he communicated, that Armenian was your language. You were clearly aware that your mother tongue was French and English to some degree at some point. So there are these competing narratives of what is your language. Do you think your resistance to Armenian was perhaps partially also a rebellion against your father's narrative of who you were supposed to be?
Yeah, and also I just, I wasn't all that close to him really growing up. So to me, it was just a strangeness is the only way I can explain it.
Strangeness or estrangement?
A strangeness. Like there was something just strange about it. And everything he did was Armenian. That's what was strange. So
everything he did was
His
Armenian.
friends were Armenian. He would go up to Binghamton to see Dr. Zhanyan, who had an Armenian last name. If we went out to dinner, it was to like the Dardanelles restaurant. He read in Armenian, and the books were these Soviet books where like the handwriting was like that big. And so I would look at it, and I couldn't even see the letters, you know? And so, and my mom didn't speak it at all. Also, my mom is Swiss, which is like this very peaceful... Like I don't think she ever got angry. She was like Mother Teresa, like an angel on earth. And my dad was always like trauma. There's always a trauma or something. You know what I mean? There's always an anger there. And so I think it was just a mixed message. And it was hard to understand exactly. You know.
Do you have siblings, Chris?
I have an older brother who's a lawyer. But he took more like Armenian history, Dr. Bornutian. And when he went to Armenia, I think it was kind of he called me. He's like, can you understand anything they say here? I said, kind of.
Were you aware as a child or maybe a young adult that Armenian is a pluricentric language, that there are two modern standards? No. Okay.
No.
We'll come back to that.
My father told me they had an accent. Well, but he went to Mechitur school, so, and I have his diploma and my mom's diploma on my wall. Like he was, I think, second or third in his class, and I think he was very, very good in Armenian. And they probably had books from Armenia as well. So to him, it was understandable.
It's true. I think that's a very important point to make. And I've said that too. If you have a very strong foundation in one with some exposure, the other one shouldn't be problematic. Right. There's also a psychological element, I would argue. If you view the other as part of your literary heritage, then it's yours. Slightly different. But if you don't want to identify with the people who speak the other because they are not your kind,
right,
then of course you'll impose all kinds of prejudices. In the same essay, you note that your father describes Armenian as a perfect language, right? He says, quote, each letter of our alphabet has just one sound, not like the confusing English parallels he brings. And here, this took me down a rabbit hole on another topic I've thought about and written about, which is reverence for language, how we cast Armenian as sacred and something to be worshipped, I would argue in opposition to something to be used.
Right.
How do you think that reverence for Armenian shaped your willingness or unwillingness to actually practice it?
To practice it or to learn it?
Both.
Well, I mean, the thing with my dad is that he had a hard time I think English was his fifth or sixth language, but it was the one that he spoke least well. So he spoke Kurdish, Turkish, Arabic, French, and Armenian. And so he couldn't get the OUs, the bow, through, tough, that thing drove him nuts. So I could sense that it was like, his view towards Armenian was like, it was this almost sacred thing. And I only realize it now that you say that because it was this kind of, it was put on a pedestal.
I've literally used that metaphor.
And it's like but it was a difficult language. I remember my friend Nancy Gabin called me once and she said, how our dads used to say it's the easiest language in the world? Well, I Googled it and it's the fifth hardest language for an Anglophone to learn after like Arabic, Chinese. So it's not all that easy, really.
It depends which language you're coming from, of course.
Yeah, but I mean, it's not like learning Spanish if you learn French.
Right.
It's like, the vocabulary is different, the letters are different. So I think there was a sense of, you have to learn it perfectly. And my father, he knew, poetry. He would recite Armenian poetry. And I was like, I don't know what you're doing. I would just be like, this is so bizarre. And this is a thing I actually thought I should add this, which is embarrassing to me now. I thought a lot of what he said was made up. So when he said we have these great poets like Varujan and Tikayan, I was like, sure. But right up, and I would say to him, right, like Victor Hugo and Robert Frost and Varujan and Tikayan, I'd be like, are you kidding me? Like, who are these people? Like, there was no internet, so if you went to, no libraries had the books. So to me, it was like this made up, kind of fake culture thing. I know, right? It's terrible. And I only went to Saturday school, I think. I wrote Sunday school, and the piece was actually Saturday school, so it was the non-language school. So, you learned history and stuff. And then it was that very, we're the first Christian nation, and then nothing happened for 1,600 years, and the genocide. And so it was just this very odd, it's not like now where you can, really go, you have, the Dornsife Center, you have, Armenian schools, like Pilibos, that didn't exist at all.
Yeah.
So I actually thought he was making a lot of it up.
But then I guess at some point you realized he wasn't.
Yes, yeah.
And then in your same piece, you talk about having to carry the burden of a 4,000-year-old history, the weight of that.
Yeah.
And that's, again, something I've thought about and that constantly shines through in my research on Armenian heritage speakers is literally the kind of moral burden of having to feel like you are the sole responsible person for the survival of this language. And if you fail, you are erasing 4,000 years. A
little bit. I mean, there is, there's also this thing where, as you get older, you realize that life isn't all that long. And I'm looking, say, at the next projects that I do, or my writing project, and I realize that I've put a lot of my mainstream things aside because I want to get the Armenian thing out of the way, kind of. My Armenian critic. Go to Armenia, do the Armenian videos, prove that you can do this, and then you can go be American. But that's really hard because...
Wait, Chris, slow down, because I'm processing this.
Right, sorry.
You want to get the Armenian thing out of the way so you can do the mainstream stuff.
Kind of. But that's the way it works in my head. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And I think it kind of works that way with a lot of other people, too.
Because it's a debt you owe? Explain why.
Yeah, because it's part of me, and I've never really expressed it. Mm-hmm. And
but are you doing it for you? Are you doing it for your father? Are you doing it for the
A
fatherland?
little bit for everyone.
For everyone.
Yeah, I think the thing with Armenian is that it's, always, there's this endangered dialogue. It's always endangered, so somehow...
Everything Armenian?
Yeah, the homeland, the language, it's a lot. It's 2/3 of it, as far as I'm concerned, right? So if you don't go there and help out, then somehow it's going to disappear, or it's in danger, or if you don't learn the language, it's dying out, Western Armenian. And then there's that weird thing of, I know that I've listened to what you refer to, that they're two perfect languages, but then there's this thing about it mixing here, and that kind of confuses me in my head, because I think, well, why can't they keep the two languages straight? If it's two languages and just talk like Makur Aramadaharan, on one end and like Arevaje on the other, and not mix them, right?
But then, I mean, people tend to accommodate regardless, whether we're speaking two different languages, two variants of the same language. We even accommodate to each other's tone and pace and body
people
language.
intermarry now, and they have kids who are half-half. So
I don't think and I've said this too, I don't think we have a new literary variant that's born out of Los Angeles.
Right.
But I think in our casual day-to-day interactions, we do accommodate. And also we have speakers for whom both, or an interesting combination or hybrid, is the variant that they hear at home, because spouses will accommodate to one another. But I think one point I'd like to make, and I want to make this clear so that is that, heritage language research is a relatively new field, just a couple of decades. And I think we've come to a place, it started with heritage language speakers or learners as failed native speakers. That's how I would have framed it, is that the goal was to turn them into a native speaker. And if they didn't achieve that, then they were failed native speakers.
Right.
And where we've come to now is respecting them as multilingual speakers and learners in their own right. The goal isn't to turn them into a native speaker, because we can't.
Right.
And, linguistics doesn't even have a good definition of a native speaker, but one thing they all agree on is that it's something you acquire in early childhood. One, that you understand the rules subliminally, and most importantly, that you are immersed in an environment where most domains function in that language. Well, for a diasporan, you can't fulfill all of those things.
Right.
And the goal isn't to become a native speaker.
Right.
And the other, of course, defining factor of a native speaker is they can fish out a non-native speaker almost immediately.
Right, of course. No, but I think, also not just with language, but with like what you choose to do creatively. Like there's a real, there's a rub between what you think is important and what you think will make you successful.
Right.
So I'm always in my head, like I have these lists of projects. I'm always thinking, okay, like if you go to Armenia and do this project, it's important and people will respect it, but like no one in Hollywood's going to care, or no one back home, and you should just write I'm writing a novel in English now. So I'm like, just finish that. And that way, then you can go back to Armenia. So I don't know if it's that like kind of, like, I don't know, am I an Armenian writer or am I just an American who goes to Armenia sometimes? So that also plays, I think.
I mean, I'm scared to double click on that one, because that's a really kind of interesting conversation that I think is being had in different circles, right? Even Yala, which is an alliance of...
Yeah, no, I know Yala.
I know. But just in case our viewers don't, it's the alliance of, was it Armenian American writers? Is that...
Yeah, it's International Alliance of Literary Armenians.
Right.
Yeah, it's basically anyone who's Armenian, basically. But you can be from Armenia.
Yes, but I think at least the original kind of founding members, none of them wrote in Armenian.
Right, exactly.
So when we had our first conversation, this was a question I asked.
Right, and I've had people in Armenia who are agents say to me, well, you guys are not Armenian writers because you don't write in Armenian.
Right.
So I don't join because it's not an Armenian organization. But I said, well, no one's stopping you from writing in Armenian.
Right.
And being a member, and you should be,
Right.
Is my attitude, but...
But you do many things, and we'll come back to that. But it seems like you like being the kind of intermediary, and you like that role, including a profile you did on me some years ago. I reread it.
I did. That's right. I forgot about that.
Yeah, in preparation. And the way you framed my work and my role again was very refreshing for me as well.
Oh, good.
Because, again, you framed me as kind of an intermediary who made things accessible and fun in a way you hadn't experienced.
Right.
And I think the biggest compliment in that whole profile was if you had had an instructor like me when you were learning Armenian, perhaps.
I probably would have spoken it much earlier.
One part of your career which I found, or your activities which I found very exciting, is this desire for you to introduce Armenian writers to English-speaking audiences.
Right.
Perhaps it's to save another Chris from not thinking Dad was making up some of this. But the question that was kind of haunting me the last couple of days is, what does it mean to be an advocate for literature written in a language that, by your own admission, is often a source of anxiety?
Well, it's just that once it's translated into English, to me, it's like a different text. Mm-hmm. So if someone reads the English text to me, they're reading the Armenian, they're by proxy absorbing the Armenian text. Although
without
they're not reading.
The anxiety.
Yeah, you know what I mean? Like, I've made it simpler for them. Like, I just translated Vahel Shagan's Odzuma for consecration. Mm-hmm. I'm just waiting to get the edits back and publish it. But I think it's a really interesting text because it's also, it's about the diaspora and kind of youth and how they're reacting to, like, fourth generation and finding meaning in being Armenian. So it explains what it's like to be an Armenian of diaspora to non-Armenians, but it also is kind of a way of explaining maybe a path for people who are diaspora Armenians. So it has like all sorts of meanings to it. So,
do I remember correctly that in a conversation you and I had, I think, was it in Philly when we were part of a conference together, you mentioned that often you translate. First of all, translating is a core part of your activities, but that often you may not translate directly from the Armenian, but through intermediary languages. I'm not talking about the Oshagan piece.
Yeah.
Just
well, no. The way I translate now, it's a little bit easier. But what I usually do is, Mark Nishanyan told me this. He goes, "What you do is you take the original text, and then you take when there are translations, any translations in languages you know." And you translate the sentence and then see if it corresponds. Because it's weird. Like, some people reacted weirdly when I told them that. And they were like, well, you should just be translating from the Armenian. I said, well, I am translating from the Armenian. But the more other texts you have, the more like different ways of translating it into English you see that you would never see. Because when you go from Armenian or any language to English, it's like one monodirectional. But if you then can also look at a German or a French translation, then you see another path that you wouldn't have had. And so it makes it richer.
Yeah, and I've spoken with several translators on this podcast and also off the podcast socially. And it's such a laborious but exciting process, translating, because you never stop thinking about it in your head, and seeing how someone else thought about it and did it can open doors that you hadn't thought to open, or it can immediately tell you, no, that's not the way.
Well, there are all sorts of ways of translating, and now I guess ChatGPT adds another layer to the whole thing. But I used to think it was funny, like, so there's a little bit of snobbery, kids that go to French lycées all over the world, because we speak French like French people. So people can't tell in France that I'm not French. Unless I tell them, and they go, oh, yes, there's a slight accent, just because they want to be, like, nitpicky and annoying and French about it.
Yes.
But I used to think it was funny. I would meet, like, people say they went to NYU and they're getting PhDs, but they were American and had an accent. And I would be like, how can you be, like, teaching French when you have an accent? And it's obviously not your first. And they would ask me and say, well, how do you say this? What does this mean exactly in English if I say this colloquial term? But then they would translate like Stendhal. And I would be like, how did she translate Stendhal if she doesn't know this basic French word? And I realized what it is they translate like Latin, kind of. They take a sentence and they find a subject and they find a verb and they do a whole paragraph and they reread the paragraph, and it's very long and intensive, but it works. And it's, in fact, sometimes more accurate because they pay more attention. Right, to the word for word, rather than just being like, oh, I know what that means, and
the cultural references, maybe. Yeah. But like, just a couple of weeks ago, a friend and I were reading Crime and Punishment together. And so we're both reading it in English, but two different translations.
Right.
And then one day we decided to kind of read the same passage together. And the difference in synonyms used and sentence structure. Like no single sentence was identical.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. Yeah.
It was really striking
Right.
just how different the translations were.
Well, that's also why it's usually with a translation, just like with a book, they'll send it out to a reader and it'll come back. And I sometimes don't know what to do with edits because I could reread, as you said, in the same text and come back with a second translation of it.
Right.
So you then have to look at it and see like what you think is wrong and change that, but not necessarily what you think is a synonym change or like a level change,
Or like a stylistic.
I like to translate. Even I translated Vassini and Dada, which is Nico Sarafian's book. I like to make it accessible rather than literary, but that's like my choice.
Right.
Right, and then it like won the Tillotson Award, and I had a reader from a new school who was Jewish, and she was like, "You opened this new world to me because it reminded me of some of the theorists that I studied, because he writes about doubt and uncertainty. Like he says, when I looked at one side, in France they have like porte in one direction and porte in the other, but it's not like the U.S. where it's a street number in New York. So if you don't know where you're going, which direction it is, like you theoretically wouldn't know that porte Maillot is in one direction and porte whatever is in the other one. So he said that he never was sure that it would actually end up in that place. So she had read these other theorists, but I think if I'd made it more literary, per se, she might not have felt that way. I think it's because she was able to read it in an easy way.
Yeah.
So
I'm going to ask a question that I think translators get annoyed with, but it's okay. I'm going to ask anyway. Just because of what you said, people often think translation is about words. But in your experience, what is the thing that most resists translation? Like, it's not vocabulary, it's not grammar, I think.
No,
what actually gets lost or maybe transformed. It's not about lost.
There's, I think, an intent, I call it, like with language. So when I am when I'm speaking in a language, I have like an intended result with what I'm saying, and it's never exactly the same because of the way things are constructed in your brain, right? So if I say something in French like, ouais, ben tu sais, c'est pas grave, right? What am I trying to say? I'm trying to say, well, it's not important, but in English I would say, that's not really important, but that's not the same thing at all, because the c'est pas grave thing is like very philosophical, and it implies that, it could be grave, but it's not. And so it's a different intent. Like one is basically like the English is shoving aside. Everyone's saying, yeah, it actually is important, kind of, but it's not like a key. It's not something that you're going to die over. And so to me, they're two totally different things. And that intent is impossible to reproduce because the languages are structured differently.
That's maybe the best answer I've had to that question.
Oh, really?
So you know. Yeah,
that's like Freud, like languages and unconscious.
Very satisfying.
Yeah. Good. I'm happy.
Okay, can we talk about your piece for the Los Angeles Review of Books? You authored the one about generation independence.
Oh, yeah.
Because you authored this wonderful essay for the Los Angeles Review of Books. First of all, for those who don't know, it's not easy to get published in the Los Angeles Review of Books. So I just want to start with that. But you argued that there is a new generation of Armenian writers who emerged right after independence, and these include people like Aram Bachian, Anna Davtyan, Hovannes Tekiosyan, Armen Ohanyan. What convinced you that something genuinely new was happening, and how did you encounter their literature? Like, what inspired you to pursue this? Yes, can we say that name again?
Arevik Asharoyan. She just asked me to translate another poem 5 minutes ago before I came here.
Who is Arevik Asharoyan? And I've had the pleasure of meeting her as well. She's a force of nature.
Force of nature. Thank you. See, it just came out of us at the same time.
Yes.
She is the literary super agent in Armenia, and she represents a lot of the young writers who are important in the Republic of Armenia today. And she's done this amazing job, not just of representing them, but of going to like book fairs. And I remember when she first started, she was attending kind of training seminars and like things for people that do what she does, like to show them this is the way you go to a book fair and whatever. And now she's really taking it to the next level. And she basically is everywhere. She's like in Frankfurt. And I think there's a weird thing in Armenian culture where, although they talk about their culture a lot, if they need to build a banquet hall, like they'll build 8 of them, but God forbid they should build like an art gallery or it's just very strange to me. So like Georgia, for example, was a representative of Frankfurt for like $6 million. Like, I don't understand how Georgia spent $6 million, but like we have this huge diaspora haven't. So she's really tackling all those issues. Like, how do you raise money to bring our authors out? How do you get them translated?
Maybe you can explain what a literary agent does.
Yeah, so literary agent finds writers, publishes them, and then markets them. And that'll be in all different forms. So both to bookstores, libraries. She sells the foreign rights too, so that anytime you'll see a book by an author from a foreign country in a different language, that'll have been brokered by a book agent. So I think she is remarkable and does both. Usually you have a foreign rights person that helps you, right? And then you have several, one for like Asia, one for North America, whatever. I could be wrong. She may be doing it all by herself or with one person, which is crazy. So she's just always very busy. And she coined the term Generation X. And I think she's correct in a sense that from what I can tell, and again, I don't have the knowledge, I don't have a PhD in Armenian literature, but up until then, to me, Armenian literature that I've read is it's either...
Armenian?
Yeah, it's either Armenian in the sense that it has to do with Armenian topics per se, or it's Soviet. So that, like, you can only write about certain things. So, like, Haran Mativosyan, who's a brilliant writer, it's always about villages and, the cows that didn't come home on time. And it's either a metaphor for something or it's really about the cows that didn't come home on time. And it doesn't quite, to me, match up with the West or with what people are expecting of literature because it's not about, like, your real life. And I think Generation X's writers are very, very good, and they're very, like... They could be from anywhere else, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way. Like, they're talking about sex. They're like a woman, like Anna Daftin. She's talking about like what it's really like to be stuck having sex with someone she doesn't want, right? Because it was either arranged in the book Hannah, the last book, right? And so the woman has like three lovers, which is never blasphemy up until a generation ago. But that's weird, right? When you see like Simone de Beauvoir and like all the female and feminist writers, you think it's odd that a woman in a Western, Armenia is kind of Western, right? It's half-half. That would be odd, but it is, right? So on the one hand, the content is very Western, and like Anna Pachan wrote about going to war and Cédès une Petite, which is a very shocking book about how people were treated, not having enough food, not having enough clothes and cold, like sexual abuse, all that stuff. He wrote about it, and it's the first generation that really writes about what's happening in Armenian society at a micro level.
Well, they're writing about the human condition.
Yeah. Right. But the other writers in the Soviet times, like, kind of were too, but in a way it was always, like, elusive and not, like,
or like
direct.
Prescriptive, maybe.
Yeah, prescriptive.
I think that's what I appreciated about your piece for the Los Angeles Review of Books is because you are introducing these Armenian writers simply as writers who happen to be from Armenia.
Right, that's the difference, right?
Yes. And I think, like, the question you're posing is what happens when readers approach Armenian literature looking for Armenia rather than looking for literature, which is what we're used to.
Right, bad writing, I think. Most of the time.
I think sometimes it's good writing. It can be good, but to not have that prerequisite.
No, I was being sarcastic.
Yeah. No,
I think it can be good writing, but I think it's outdated writing.
Right.
In the same sense that, now I'm going to get in trouble. I've been rereading William Saroyan, and I actually really think as I reread it, as I get older, I like it more and more. But there is kind of a sense that it's a little bit in a time capsule, right? Where the world is good, and if you just try hard enough, like the donkey that like broke down 4 times won't break down because someone's looking over. It's lovely, but it's not like something that a kid I live in Washington Heights, so like some Dominican kid in Washington Heights, if he reads it, he's not going to be like identifying with it necessarily in that same way.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been thinking about this recently, like what I liked to read when I was younger, what I hated and rebelled against later,
Right.
and then what I come back to and appreciate at a different stage.
Well,
at a
good writing is
different-
good writing
yes.
is a thing, right?
Yes.
And that's not describable either. And Sharon just writes very well. But I remember I wrote a book of poetry, a poet in Washington Heights, which I was asked to read at Notre Dame, a couple of universities. And the class was really interesting. There were two kids from Washington Heights, which is weird, like in the middle of South Bend. And then there was an African-American kid who was a very good-looking guy. And he goes, I really wanted you to read the salty stuff. And I was like, I avoided the salty stuff because I don't want to end up in jail because you guys are like 17. You know what I mean? Like, but it kind of proved to me that what they really want is stuff that they identify with.
Well, I guess, and this goes to my next question, which is many of the writers you champion, like the ones you listed, write about war, alienation, disillusionment, sex, queerness. Is it fair to say that you think Armenian literature is at its most interesting when it's challenging Armenian society rather than affirming it or lauding?
Yeah, definitely, because I think it gets to be a little bit like poetry recital on Tashkent camp. You know what I mean? Like, you know, it's like if it's always about the nation. And, you know, I think there's a real danger. I'm not like a ethno-historian, but I do get a sense that with small peoples or people that have survived a lot of trauma, that there's an overemphasis on being exceptional.
But also, who decides, who sets the boundaries on what the canon is? Like I've talked to
Right.
some of my complit friends about what gets taught in Armenian literature classes, both in the diaspora and in Armenia, and it's like we haven't gone past the 80s.
Right.
In the diaspora, it depends if Soviet writers will get introduced or not. I think some do. Some have passed that.
Right.
It's like pre-genocide. And then in Armenia, I'd be curious, actually. I'd love to know if school-age children encounter contemporary literature. I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't know. You have to ask Adevik would know probably, but I assume that has to be put into the textbooks, right? Mm-hmm. But I think young people, so people I know, well, that's the other problem is when you go to Armenia, like I go hang out with a couple of friends and stay with them, like in this place, Vahakni, it's outside of the city, and there'll be 100 people at a dinner party, but like only 5 are from Armenia. Like everyone else is like Lipananahai or Syria.
Yeah, there's definitely a diaspora bubble in Armenia, or a repat bubble.
Right, and even the Armenians that hang out with them tend to not be typical of the typical Armenian, you know, that you might meet in the street. But I do think that for people who are going to university, these writers are very normative now.
Yes.
Like Adam Pashan and Anna Daftian. And
yes.
Those are the people they read. They find them normal. That's what they would rather read in their spare time, and that they do. So I think it's already. I think what Adevik's done, but also what they've done as writers, is already having an impact. I mean, they're winning. Like Anam won like the European Writers Prize a couple of years ago, which was amazing.
Right.
So I definitely think that is really important to normalizing everything in Armenia, like the way we see the other, the way it's like there's Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, and how you can't be at odds with your neighbor or not understand who they are. That has to change if we're going to move forward. And I think literature has a really important role, like if you can read each other's works.
Yeah. Chris, what gives you the most optimism about Armenian literature right now?
Just these writers are excellent writers. I think we need to export them more, both to the diaspora and to non-Armenians. We need to get the word out more so that more people read them.
Do you think the diaspora would digest thematic?
Yeah, sure.
You think so? Because I tend to find the diaspora much more conservative than the homeland.
Well, there's I was going to say there are two diasporas. I mean, there are the people who are Armenian and read, and then there are people who live in kind of very conservative, like the Lebanese type neighborhoods from the old days, and those people might not be as much. But I think there's a lot of people, I've assumed your students would probably be very receptive.
Some would. Some, I think, would struggle.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Because if they've gone to Armenian school, then they've experienced the classics
Right.
And their exposure is limited to what they get at home and at school.
Right.
So there's nowhere else they would be getting this.
Right.
If they haven't gone to school, actually that cohort is perhaps more open. You know, when I look at your career, it's a lot. Like, how many lives have you lived? Poet, novelist, playwright, translator, curator. I mean, like, we visited you in New York in your art gallery, critic, filmmaker, documentarian, gallery founder. And I guess maybe an obvious question would be, how do you find time to do all of this? But I think maybe the not obvious question is, what drives you, or what questions are you pursuing that can't be contained by a single medium? Like, why do you need to do all these things to do what you want to do?
I think because possibly my parents, not to blame everything on your parents, were...
But they're convenient.
and they're dead, so they can't complain. No, my parents were very smart, hardworking people. They were immigrants. My grandparents on my mom's side were, they came across the Swiss-Italian border because they were poor during World War II. And my grandmother was a cook in an Italian school, and my grandfather made cabinets. And my father's family were just genocide survivors. And I think my grandfather was kind of clever, and he owned an ouzo factory. So by the time he made cutlery sets, like for Turkish families while he was fleeing as a fidei, and then ended up... So he had a little bit of money, but that was all lost again in Lebanon because everything had happened. So I think they were not really able to explain what you do with creative energy or that it's a career. And I think I like different things. I love life, and I like people. So it's just... I just wanted to experiment. And I think I started probably a little bit later. And so I was very analytical always. So I wrote essays and then majored in comparative literature, which is like, if you're smart and you study, it's kind of like, oh, fun, right? Like the theory of whatever, phallocentric, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's interesting, and you risk less because it's not your writing. And there's a place for it. Like, you can technically become a teacher or do something with it. And then I realized that wasn't really my calling either, because just theory at the time got very problematic, as you know. So I think I started kind of late, and I just was like, oh, let me try this, let me try that, and I kind of enjoy it all.
Are you still trying?
Yeah, I think I'm concentrating more on my writing now, my own writing, and then I curate with Tamar Hovsepian. We have a curatorial practice, so we have a couple of shows up in Europe. We're doing one National Gallery in Armenia, so where I'm kind of able to handle those two things. And my writing tends to be, now I'm writing novels or films, so they all relate.
The curatorial work you do with Tamar is, again, introducing Armenian artists to the world?
We do both. We have the majority of our artists are Armenian from Armenia, although not all of them. We have one artist who's Iranian American. We have one guy, James Gordner, who's like just an American rock and roll dude. But yeah, most of them are because Tamar is from Armenia, and so she has that base of artists, and we represent like Garin Ohanyan and Solak Topcan, who are two of the big painters in Armenia. So we have like a base that we wouldn't have here. It would be like representing, I don't know, like Rauschenberg and Warhol. Like, we don't represent those people here. So the Armenian thing is an advantage and a disadvantage, right? Because it gives you access as a small country to things you wouldn't necessarily have in the U.S. And on the other hand, it limits you a little bit. And so maybe you have to figure out a way of expanding on what people have traditionally done within it, which is what we're trying to do. I don't know if that makes sense, really.
I don't know. I keep thinking about, like, you're choosing these artists because their art says something.
Right.
But they also happen to be Armenian.
Right. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword, but we don't represent... I mean, people come to us all the time with artists that we just won't represent. Even some of them are, like, famous in one area and they want to
Dabble.
do art. And, like, Tamar tends to be much more... She's like, and I'm like, but he's really nice, But we have very high quality artists, and we don't hedge on that.
So is Tamar the equivalent of Arevik in the art world?
I think so, but in Armenia there's about 5 or 6 curators that do really good work, and we all know each other. And some are at Kefestian, some are at the National Gallery. one or two are independent, and there's us there's not much else if you look at what's being done.
I want to go back to the house museums.
Yes.
So this is a video series that you're doing for CivilNet.
Right.
Introducing these house museums that are all over Armenia. I think I watched a couple, and in the introductory one, you said there are 27.
27,
I knew there were many. I didn't realize that many. The Parajanov Museum is probably not my favorite place in Armenia, but one of my favorite places in the world.
Oh, really?
I think
You too?
everyone should experience.
Isn't it fun? It's a fun
it's
place.
the most whimsical place I've ever been to.
Yeah.
I also had the fortune of going and visiting with a grad student here. At the time, he was doing a PhD in the Slavic department on Parajanov, who may be probably the most well-informed people about Parajanov in the world. So I got this very private, special tour. But I was thinking about, again, trying to piece everything you do together, that these house museums, and you just indicated they're not always the house that the person grew up in and created. They're not necessarily about objects, about place. They're often about memory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they are. Right.
What is your vision with this project? How do you want to frame these? And what is the goal?
Well, I mean, there are only 5 of them that I've done, and the question is, do you go back and do more? But that's a question of funding and time, and we tried to pick the 5 that were more relevant. So there's one on Parajanov, one on Chadens, one on Isahakian, because I just like Isahakian, and Parir Sevak, and one on a woman called Lucy Gaguleci, which I had never heard of, and I didn't necessarily want to do, but 3 different people told me, oh, you have to go. And Lucy Gaguleci was from Nakhichevan, and she basically saved an entire culture by literally migrating objects from her house and neighbors' houses when the massacres happened in different times in Nakhichevan. And so it's like it's an amazing house. You feel like you've walked back in time and into a different culture. So I included that because I thought, and she's also a painter herself. So we have those 5, and I don't know if it makes sense to go back and do more, but I'm open to that. What I liked about it was I think the people at CivilNet did a really good job of just all around, and they turned out to me as well as they would if they had been done for PBS by PBS. I don't see much quality difference. And so someone in England has contacted me. They want to go back and do a series of maybe food, like the trip, you visit a place that's famous but also has great food. And do that in Armenia and Georgia. So I think I would be thrilled if it led something parallel that also happens in Armenia. And then, I don't ever have a linear way about my career. I stopped trying to do that.
That's become clear.
Right. Well, no, because I think a lot of people, I've seen a lot of people in the creative fields who are very, I think you have to be very tenacious. But sometimes if you're too tenacious in a difficult field and you don't get exactly what you want, to direct Star Wars or something, then it just never happens. And I want it to be open to always doing interesting things, which hopefully I'm doing. So, so I would like to maybe either continue those or do the ones of that British company, which would be more of a
culinary
gastro,
tourism experience. Did anything surprise you or take you off guard as you were working on these house museums? Or did you have aha moments or?
I did. It kind of complements what I was saying before. I started off thinking, Chadens is a great Armenian poet, and Parajanov is a great Soviet and Armenian. And at the end, I realized they're just really great poets and really great artists, period. And that was a revelation to me because it happened without my realizing it. Because if you need to know enough about people.
Yes.
Both in your friendships with people in real life and when you're studying people and reading them to really judge them correctly. And so the more you learn about these people, the more remarkable they are.
So true, Chris. And I have to tell you, in my experience visiting museums in Armenia, I'm also always positively struck by the expertise at the museums. I've always encountered really great guides, really great directors, and even if not by the museum staff, there are people who can serve as mediators in a sense to help you discover.
I always want to encourage people to invest in art in Armenia, in the museums. And there are people that have these brilliant collections of bunker art, of Yergort art, like third floor art. And it's just kind of lying there. It hasn't been... and if you see, for example, the Museum of Modern Art, it's like kind of in shambles. But then they renovated the National Gallery. It looks like the Louvre. It's gorgeous. It's absolutely breathtaking. Everything's been redone. All the paintings of Sureniances and have been completely restored, like by Western standards. And there's people who I've never heard of, and Tamar had never heard of. And we went with like my friend Nina Havnani, and she'd never. And if the three of us have never even heard of someone, it's kind of odd because it's not like a huge culture, right? And like these beautiful miniatures from like Tbilisi. And they had a show of Abbas Kiarostami, the Persian filmmaker, or Iranian filmmaker, and it was just his stills, and it was very sophisticated. I mean, it was like the opposition was very jarring in a good way. So I think the more you research it and the more you spend time in Armenia and with Armenian culture, you realize that it is a world-class culture and that it's fascinating in of itself, and then hopefully you don't have to make that choice that I was talking about before.
Yeah. This may be the second or third time you've said Western standards.
Right.
Is the Western standard the end-all and be-all? Is the goal for
No, I don't mean
Armenian
Western
art or literature? And of course, I'm playing devil's advocate
No,
here.
it could be like Chinese or Japanese
the
standards.
Eastern standard.
No, I just mean that there's obviously like, because Armenia's been at war now for 40 years, and the Soviets were kind of like somewhere in the middle. Like they kind of preserved things, but like when you scratch the surface, it wasn't really correctly done. Like things weren't properly, the patinas on things weren't properly done so that they would wear off after a while, right? Because there's technically less money than, say, in the U.S. or France, right? So I just mean by Western standards just that they are able to preserve what they have correctly, and so that when people visit, they see how wonderful it is. And also that it'll stay with time and not degrade. Mamata Nadaran is a perfect example. I mean, it's just beautifully done.
Yes.
So I
no
think
matter
it's just
how many times I visit, I'm awestruck.
It is, right? I mean, just a beautiful, like, the little jewels of, like, these little 13th century books with, like, Tatar and Mongol. Like, I mean, it's amazing stuff. So I think if we can do that too, it's not that much, right? Because it's not a huge country, but there is a lot for a small country. If we can preserve what we have and move forward with people like Arevik and sending more people from here who have expertise and just doing the exchange. And, and you'll see that some of the videos are well done. I mean, they were done, from Armenia and from my desk, like we're 3,000 miles away, and we managed to, the post was done that way. So, and we managed, in spite of that, to get these done, and it was a great experience.
Amazing.
Thanks to Salpi.
Amazing. Yes. I mean, CivilNet is doing all kinds of interesting series like this. I know they have one on wine.
Yeah.
And I guess it's such a beautiful moment right now, this kind of diaspora-Armenia collaborations of the two nodes discovering each other or rediscovering each other.
Yeah.
It's an interesting moment. So looking back at everything you've done, everything you've experienced, and going back to your language anxiety piece, was Armenian, the language, ever the problem? Was it about the language?
No, but I think that the textbooks and stuff that one had didn't help either because they were very didactic. And I think, no, I don't think it's, I think it's a situation, right? That Armenia's far away. It's not an easy place to visit. Lebanon's having a war constantly. So both places have been at war. And so, I learned German. I went to the Goethe Institute, and they sit you down, and they're like, you're going to learn, it's very German, 200 words a day for the next 30 days. At the end, you'll know 6,000 words. And it's all transformational grammar. So it's like, ich bin, and then it's like in der Stadt, am Strand, I'm at the beach, I'm here, I'm there. And you learn in a very, like, active way, like what they call, like, a collectif bilingue in France. It's bilingual, it's active, and it's spoken from beginning, and the grammar is taught to you only when you need to know it, kind of.
In context.
In context, right? And you have a little book that says grammar on it. And you sometimes go back and forth because you're like, I have no idea what that is. Why is the word at the end? Oh, you can put the word at the end, the verb at the end. Great. So it was very organic. And then you would go out at night to nightclubs if you wanted to, or to the bakery, and then you would practice it, right? So it was reinforced. It was 24/7, and I think that was a problem with Armenian, is that one does not have the opportunity to practice it in that way 24/7 unless you go to Armenia now.
So how do you feel in Armenia now?
I feel fine. When they speak quickly, sometimes I have to do a double take.
But do you interact in Armenia?
Yeah, I do. I speak Armenian to them.
Western? Or do you accommodate?
The little guy from a shawarma stand who insisted on speaking English to me on purpose, I will speak to in Western Armenian just to annoy him. From Gragi Mud, if he's out there listening. I would say like Meg had shawarma guzam, and he would say, if you can't speak Armenian, speak English. And I'd say Nora and Meg, it's like not that different. But no, so I translate in my head. And now I don't need to translate. Like, instead of saying Gohosim, I'll say like Hosumam.
Oh my gosh.
Like very quickly, right? And then I'll say ko instead of ku. And then I'll try to do as much of it as I can, realizing that it's not perfect,
And that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
So if you ended up in that bakery in LA today, which is the scenario you described in the piece. Yeah, because the whole language anxiety piece is based on this. Why don't you tell the encounter?
Oh, it was just funny. I was in a bakery and I walked in and, they had things written that I could read, like bereg and nazuk and whatever. And I know how to say plastic bag. It's like plastike dobragi. And I know how to say, is it possible garelie? And to put as tenel. And I just couldn't get the sentence out. Like plastike dobragi garelie tenel. Can you please just put it in a plastic bag? And in my head, I saw it and I just couldn't say it. Because I didn't want to make a mistake. But I did it yesterday at the, the baklava factory.
Oh, good.
Yes.
And?
It was fine.
They put it in the plastic bag?
Put it in the plastic bag. She did, actually. So she wrapped it and, and my friend Ankina was like, oh, well, that worked. So, yeah, no, it's a question of just practicing.
In all these languages that you live in and work in, and all the media that you work in, what has Armenian taught you that the other dozen or so languages couldn't?
Oh, the importance of tenacity. I imagine maybe learning Chinese would be similar.
But then you wouldn't be performing Chinese identity.
That's true. No, just because there's 10,000
characters.
Yeah. So, like, no matter how good you are in a language, you still have to sit there and... and that, you really have to learn it, you have to practice it, and you have to understand the differences between the two languages, right? And, process it.
Do you feel different when you are playing with Eastern Armenian? You know how they say, you have a different personality in different languages, or different sides of you come out. Is Eastern Armenian, where is it in relation to...
I feel like more of a foreigner.
In Eastern Armenian?
Yeah, completely.
So you're performing foreign language competence when you're speaking
Yeah, and
Eastern
when I speak to them in Western Armenian, I'm conscious of the fact that they're going to know that I'm not from there, even if they could tell anyway because of my accent, probably. But, right? It's kind of interesting. I had this discussion with Rubina and Maria because I write a column for EVN Report. And Rubina, because she's from Lebanon, she doesn't feel it that much.
But Rubina, if I'm not mistaken, because I know her sister Shoresh, there's some kind of a Hayastansi thread. I think their mom was a repat.
Or maybe. I didn't realize they were sisters for 2 years.
Yes.
I was talking to them separately. And then I go, my sister says hello. And I was like, who's your sister? But yeah, probably. But there's a lot of that. I'm staying with someone whose mom is from Haleb and repatriated. And the daughter was born in Armenia. And Tamar is the same way. Tamar is half West. Her parents, one were from Van. And so they spoke Western and Eastern. So she can speak both. So it's actually much more complicated than it looks.
Yes.
And it's not as separated, which is something you've said before.
Yes. And a dream project for me right now would be to look at diasporans or repats who function in both Western and Eastern in Armenia, and the kind of the triggers of when they decide which. And it's not as obvious or as simple as you would think, because sometimes they do what you just said, which is they have complete competence and comfort in Eastern Armenian, but they will choose Western Armenian to make a point.
Well, it's funny, last night there was a picture of that guy, Adis, what's his last name, a singer, he's a very famous Beirut singer, and he's sang, what's the song, Karun.
Yeah.
And we were just joking about it, and then I got to the Eko Sich, and I'm like, why is it Eko? Like, what? And then we were trying to figure out, like, well, it's Eastern Armenian, right? But why is it in a song by a guy from Beirut?
Oh, yeah, and the reverse, too, is like...
but that explains why I didn't understand it when I was singing as a kid. I would glom over. I'd go karun, achkerov, right? Because I understood the achk part of it. Yeah. But now I know it's just Eastern Armenian.
Or Artur Mescian, he has so many songs which are based on poems by Moshe Rishchan.
Right.
But then you hear the Zacharut version, and he took a Western poem and Easternized it.
Right, exactly.
But then what is present tense in Western becomes future tense in Eastern. And when I was reading it, I was like, generations of Eastern Armenians have thought this is to happen in the future instead of happening now, at the moment.
To answer your question, every time I say BD in Armenia, I feel like a red dot is lighting up as Indian, and they're looking at me and they're like, you're doing it on purpose. Stop doing that. But I like it, and I like gor. I love that.
Oh, yeah.
And I know that it comes from Turkish, probably from Istiyor or whatever, but
I mean, god is your you know?
I know, Dukalam god. I like it. What are you doing? I am walking.
I almost wish you would say gnumem god.
Okay, that I can't do yet, but maybe. So, but I think it's all fascinating. And, you always think you have to do everything when you're very young in life. When you're young, and I realize that, you don't. You can discover new things as you get older. So.
What's next for Christopher Atamian?
I want to keep writing and curating and making films. Yeah.
Well, now you can cross this off your bucket list.
My bucket list, thank you. It wasn't really my bucket list. It's just I really admire you, and I like the language therapy concept, so I thought it would just be fun to do.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Language Therapy with Dr. K is produced and edited by Brandon Walsh. Geram Murnetian provides technical support with creative direction by Fian Gambo. Language Therapy with Dr. K is a podcast from the USC Dornsife Institute of Armenian Studies.